I'll show you how to change the alternator on a 2007 Ford Ranger 2.3 liter. The first step will be to disconnect the battery using an 8mm socket and ratchet wrench. Remove the leads of the battery on the positive terminal. When you're done loosening the lead of the battery, you're going to want to set it so that it doesn't reconnect with the terminal of the battery. You can also remove the ground, but that's not explicitly required. We're going to want to loosen up this cover with a 7mm nut wrench. Easily just comes right off. And then the air duct, you're going to want to use a 1/4 or 5/16 rather nut driver and loosen this up. And once it's loose, you should be able to pull this back. You can flip that back just to give you a little bit more space. I've already pulled out the serpentine belt by loosening the tensioner with a 3/8 drive and pulled it back from the other pulleys. The alternator's down here. There's two main bolts. I've already kind of pre-loosened them here. But those are removed. The two bolts, bottom and top. I found that this is pretty tight in here and I can't really loosen it, so I've decided to get a piece of wood and my sledgehammer, tap on this, kind of unseat it and see it coming. Now, one thing to be concerned about is I've not yet disconnected the wires in the back. That's also very tight. Before I fully unseat this, we'll grab those. I've got a pick that I'll use to get in there and try to unseat that. It might be easier to do it from underneath. You have a little bit more clearance than going from the top. But the way this thing's in here, it's really tough. So I was finally able to wiggle this free using and away from the housing. Just using one of those pick. I'm going to try to go in from the side wheel well underneath to try to see if I can grab this cover. So I ultimately was able to get it out of the wheel well to pull that down. Next thing I'll do is take off that bolt. Piece is to disconnect the wire, the lead wire, and that's a 10mm ratchet wrench or nut driver, and then you should be able to pull the entire unit out. I might have to take off the hose here in order to do that. As you can see, I've got the alternator disconnected and removed from the housing. However, there's not enough space in order to pull it out. It gets hit by the air conditioning unit compressor and this the fan case. So what I'm going to do next is remove the fan case and see if I can get it out. Okay, I'm going to disconnect the fan case using a 10mm ratchet. Already kind of loosened them. There's 2 bolts on the other side. I've taken that one out as well. It's 10mm. Fluid reservoir is attached to the fan case, so I'm going to pull that off as well using an 8mm ratchet. Finally, now that I have this kind of loose, you don't want to move it too much. There's some fairly rigid tubing down below that's it's attaching to the case. I need to disconnect this wire, and then I should be able to remove the fan case. Okay, so that was actually quite difficult to get. There's 2 clips on this side of this thing. I had to pick them up with a pick and then try to wiggle them apart, but this again is small space, so it's hard to get at. Done, you can start to pull this out. It's a little tight as well, so it takes a little bit. The fan case just pops right off, and I'll set it aside. Now you can see I'll have plenty of room to grab the alternator, wiggle it around the fan itself, and bring it up. Okay, I've got the old one removed and the new one here. You'll see it came with a screw 10mm nut that I'll remove. Everything else I'll keep in place. Looks like it matches up position wise, and we'll start to reinstall this. Okay, so the whole thing's removed at this point. I'm going to put the new one in here and wiggle past this fan blade, and we'll see how it goes. The new one resting in there, but I now need to reconnect the wires in the back, which if you recall how I removed those, it was through the wheel well, so that's what I'm going to try. Added clearance with the fan case removed. I was able to reach in and kind of back here to get that nut started, and then I'll take the 10mm ratchet wrench and tighten it up. But otherwise, it's started. First component is on. I was able to get that tied back in. The main power, I'm going to mount it before I put in the other sensor clip to the back. So to do that, you reuse the bolts that I had, 1/2-inch socket with a ratchet. It takes a little bit to hold it in place, but once you do, you should be able to get those started by hand and tighten them up with 1/2-inch ratchet wrench. Okay, now that that's mounted, the last thing to do is connect the last clip wire back to the back. The easiest way I've seen to do this is kind of go underneath the wheel well and clip it in right there. Pretty much doing this blind, so it's kind of a little bit of trial and error. Okay, the alternator's now in place, bolted, all power is reconnected, so now it's a matter of reassembling the engine compartment in a reverse of how we started. So I'm going to do the fan case first. I'll put that in. There's a couple of clips there, and in the bottom it sets into a couple clips. Obviously be protective of the power steering fluid reservoir. Alright, we'll see how that goes. At the bottom it goes into these tracks on both sides. So now that we have that in place on both sides, I will reattach the screws here and down below. Attach the screws, there's two screws that hold this in. Here, just hand tighten them for now. And then reattach the screws that hold the power steering reservoir. A little easier to do that without the fan case on, but it looks like the tensioner bar worked, and everything appears to be kind of in place based on the diagram that's right here. I have a 2.3 liter, and all the pulleys and things look like they're in the right spot. Next is to reassemble the air housing manifold. We'll do that by replacing the air filter box top and then the air line. Okay, got that box top on. With the 2007, everything's really tight in here. It's difficult to kind of get that around these flex tubes for the air conditioner, and you don't want to disturb that too much, but Ford has made it a little more challenging to maintain these things. Okay, to tighten these clamps back up, I have a 8mm nut driver. Same thing over here. You want to reattach this nameplate with a 7mm nut driver. It's going into plastic, so it doesn't need to be cranked too hard, just snug. Okay. On here is to reconnect the leads of the battery. 8mm ratchet. I'm going to do the positive terminal. Again, 8mm ratchet. Tighten it up. Not too tight. And then cover that back up. Okay, as you can see, I was able to start the car with the residual power in the battery. I'm going to test the charging system with my Milton battery tester. Reading on here, the reading looks great after changing out the alternator right in the OK 14 volts. It previously was, with the old alternator, was running at about 12. So everything looks good.